Welcome to the first in a series of TAIQ events that will be focused on driving diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. My name is Betty Ng, and I am a co-founder of TAIQ, which stands for the Think, Act, Interact Quotient for Inclusive Behavior. So instead of your EQ or your IQ, it's your TAIQ. And you can find us online by checking out taiqworld.com. I am joined here today by some really amazing thought leaders that we are all excited to hear from regarding what is really required to move the needle with respect to diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, and then specifically fostering an inclusive culture. So today we have Laura Ortman, who is the President and Chief Revenue Officer of Cologix. We have Jack Guess, Global Diversity and Inclusion Lead of Wealth Management and Personal Banking at HSBC, and Janine Ting Jansen, Senior Director of Inclusion and Diversity at North America at Teva Pharmaceuticals. So our plan today is to spend about 8 minutes or so on introductions and then launch into about a 30-minute moderated Q&A. After that, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience, and then we'll share some concluding thoughts. I would request that anyone who has any questions, please do submit your question using the Q&A function at the bottom of your computer. So there's a menu there. So I'd like each of the speakers to introduce themselves and to describe briefly their DEIB journeys and why they are so committed to moving the needle. So a little bit in terms of my story. For over 20 years, I was that woman of color rising up the ranks to become a senior executive at a large financial services firm. Frankly, with my share of challenges as well as successes. And my day jobs were primarily in business roles, so primarily in strategy and also M&A. While I was a senior vice president of corporate development in my last corporate role, I also had a night job, and that night job was to be the co-chair of the Women's Employee Resource Group, as well as a founder of the Asian Leadership Initiative. Outside of work, unfortunately, I was also a victim of hate incidents. And so I decided to channel my pain into my own purpose and also ultimately promise. So working on those solutions to ultimately move the needle with respect to DEIB. And so about 5 years ago, I left corporate and really decided to pursue my purpose, which is to be a builder of inclusive and high-performing culture. And 5 years ago, I founded Inspiring Diversity. And then 3 years ago, I co-founded TAIQ with Marlon Young, my amazing partner. And so together, the two companies really are focused on empowering authenticity, building cultural competence, and embedding inclusion into cultural DNA. So now I am going to first turn it over to Laura for her to share her story.
Thank you, Betty. And first, thank you for the opportunity. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. So my own journey started really when I was young. I came to the US from Europe and didn't speak a word of English. I had to overcome many challenges and obstacles while learning how to successfully assimilate into a new culture and a new language. So from this early childhood experience, I truly appreciate the importance of inclusion and belonging. I grew up with 2 older brothers and parents who always supported me in whatever I wanted to accomplish, whether it was in sports. And for example, I was one of 2 girls in an all-boy basketball team and really achieving my personal goals in the technology field. So this gave me the confidence when I started my career, when really there were a lot fewer women in technology roles or in leadership positions. So throughout my personal and career journey, there were times where I felt very supported, as well as times that I didn't feel like I belonged or was heard. As a young female executive in IT, I had strong male leaders and allies who believed in gender equality. Yet I also faced gender biases, especially in meetings. While I had a seat at the table, my ideas were often ignored unless articulated from my male counterparts. Now, being a mother of 2 young daughters, I have started to reflect on how I can help make a career in business and technology more attainable for women. I want to help pave the way for women in tech and business. So for me, it's about listening, learning, and leading, but it's about authenticity and vulnerability. I started to become more involved when I was at VMware and joined the company's VM Women Executive Leadership Council. And when I was at Equinix, I also had the great opportunity to be part of the company's Women's Leadership Network. And now at Cologix, we're a member of the Women in Tech Council and Colorado Technology Association. So I continually want to help drive and impact diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging wherever I'm at. And at Cologix, the leadership team is committed to driving change. And we're also positioned to set clear corporate values that instills diversity and inclusion into our culture.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Laura. I'll turn it over to Jack.
Thanks. I mean, it's brilliant to be here with Laura, Janine, and Betty. And Betty, you know, hearing your terrible story about your own personal experience just made me realize, you know, they knock us down, but we always come back stronger. So I am so pleased to be here today. You know, D&I is such a big passion, I think, for everyone on this call. And just, you know, to how I got into it, because, you know, a lot of us, we experience it ourselves and figure out we want to change the world because of our own experiences. You know, I've been with HSBC for 15 years, and I started when I was 19 in my local bank branch. And I was really fortunate to have come from a family where I was able to come out as a gay man pretty early on. I had a supporting environment, and getting into the workforce and joining that local bank branch within 2 or 3 months, I felt comfortable coming out and being myself and just bringing my whole self to work straight away. So for 6 years, I managed to bounce around and do quite a few things. And then in 2011, I got the opportunity to move with the bank over to Hong Kong. Now, I was fine as an openly gay man in Hong Kong. I was an immigrant. I had no family pressures there. I had no societal pressures as well. But it was immediately obvious to me that that was not the case for a lot of Hong Kong people and a lot of people who lived in Asia. The conversation around gender identity, sexual orientation was simply forbidden. And actually what we saw is a lot of individuals may have been outed over the weekend and come into the office on Monday and said, I've got to leave. I'm resigning. I'm moving to another bank. This is it. I can't stay here. And so I was one of the founders of the Pride Network relatively early on in 2011. And that's how I started getting into D&I, working within an employee resource group, which I know many, many people on this call will already do, opened my eyes up to the other diversity and inclusion strands, but also the power of advocacy in changing organizational perceptions and changing the way that large companies actually position themselves as inclusive organizations, not only for their employees, but also for their customers. And so I was the first full-time D&I practitioner for HSBC in 2014, and I've managed to continue doing that to the position where I am today, where, you know, it is brilliant to be able to shape the strategic views of an organization that has such a reach around the world. So it's so grateful to be here with you all.
Thank you so much, Jack. That's great. Janine, last but not least.
Thanks, Betty, and thanks for inviting me to join. I'm thrilled to be here with my colleagues to talk about this topic. So I think for me personally, you know, there's a personal, professional side, and all of our journeys have been very different. But I knew from a young age that I was just different. I was the only fill in the blank in a room. And when I fill in the blank for my own blank, right, of what I see myself as, is that I'm multicultural. I'm both Mexican and Chinese, and I was born in New York. Now, having others, right, come to me and fill in the blank for me, it really opened my eyes as I grew up, right? And what I mean by that is that people perceive, right, different areas of where you're from. And that kind of falls into where we are today with calling them microaggressions, where they are. And for me, there was a real startling moment of, depending where you were, who you were speaking with, of how that reflected. In some cases, that was a positive, right? And in others, it was, well, then you must be very, right, fill in the blank again. So for me, I think I was a first gen to go to college. I had my parents here, and my grandparents came to the United States. So for us, we're American born, right? And having the influences of the cultures, I think of myself as ambicultural. I'm 100% all of these things, right? And going into my role as a mother, right, really positioning my children with the information they need to really be confident about who they are. But here, I think from my experience as going to college for the first time, going into my first role, you encounter different biases that fit the bill for the different ethnicities and races that people will place upon you. So for me, it's always been a moment of how do I overcome that, right? It's been a constant piece on my shoulder, overcoming that, neutralizing it, and then turning it into action. So I think for myself, I'll also share, I was able to participate in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute internship program during college, as well as a conference on Asian Pacific American leadership when I did an internship as well in DC. And both of these opportunities, it gave me greater fluency on what people who look like me encounter. And that was really eye-opening as well, because when I think of myself being in New York and living in somewhat of a bubble of diversity, when I encountered others of foreign-born, or they're growing up in different parts of the country, all of the challenges were different, yet we're still categorized together. So as we look at this, of how we action against it, it's been a personal passion of mine. And I've taken that with me in the work I've done for law firms, and when it comes to recruitment, the work I've done in finance, and now in pharma. And it really, I think with this, it's culture first. So I'm proud to say that Teva, we value fostering an inclusive culture. We have different core values as a company that we stand tall around that really support an inclusive, diverse environment, right? And I think when we look at all these different companies, if any prospective employee, those are questions to ask if that's important to you. And it's important to ask about how you'll be treated, but how they treat your peers, right? So this work, there's so much to it, depending what sticks. Just a pure passion of mine, both personally and all of the different roles I've held, and how we all do this together. Because I'm sure even with the four of us here and our approaches, they're very similar, yet very different depending on who we're serving. So I'm happy to share that story and be here to really just hear from what all the questions are today.
Thanks, Janine. And I'm really excited to engage in this discussion. Actually, for all the participants, the four of us actually really do represent quite a bit of diversity in terms of our backgrounds, our industries, and so forth, just on so many different levels, the sizes of our organizations, the geography, so not just what people typically think of in terms of diversity, in terms of race and gender, but just more broadly. And so I'm really excited to engage in this conversation. So TAIQ stays ahead of the curve, so our clients can stay ahead of the curve. And we do that by embedding inclusion into cultural DNA. Oftentimes what we hear, though, is that organizations are more reactive than proactive in terms of DEIB, because oftentimes it may be responses to what's on the news, lawsuits, other things that may be happening. So we're actually going to launch our first poll, because I'd really like to hear what the audience thinks. Do you believe organizations are generally more proactive or reactive with respect to DEIB initiatives?
Oh, I thought we could vote, but apparently we are, the panelists are forbidden. We would tilt the scores.
I tried as well, Jack.
You will have a lot of time to talk about your perspectives. So it'll be good to see what others think. So we've gotten quite a number of responses so far. I'm just going to wait literally 5 more seconds. I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. Wow. I expected it to tilt towards reactive, but I didn't expect it to be quite this stark. So I'm actually going to turn it over, maybe first to Laura, to hear actually your perspectives on this whole proactive versus reactive and what you're seeing. So take it away.
Thank you, Betty. And actually, when I saw the numbers, I was a little surprised too. I would have thought it would have been closer to 50-50, but I think it really depends on the industry that you're in and, you know, your own experiences that you've had. So from my perspective, you know, we need to be proactive and stay ahead of the curve. You know, there's been heightened awareness and discussion over the past several years about DEIB, but the key, you know, really to long-term success is to include DEIB as part of the business strategy and culture. You know, at Cologix in the technology industry, we prioritize and act. And one example is our CEO acted as soon as he was appointed. He hired 2 diverse female executives, our president and COO and myself, to not only help drive business growth and success, but also to help cultivate the right culture, focusing on diversity and inclusion. And today our senior leadership team is now comprised of 60% women. So in order to stay ahead of the curve, you know, you need to realize that this is a continuous journey. You know, sometimes you will need to be reactive, and it does not end with a specific goal or checkbox for the organization. And for me, this really means driving awareness, continued awareness, and sharing stories across your organization. It's about storytelling. It's about sharing success stories where you've had challenges, not just from your current company, but also previous ones and other aspects of your life.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, Laura. I'm going to turn it over to Jack. Jack, would love to hear your reactions to what you saw on the poll and then just what you're seeing more generally. And then what can organizations do to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, so we spoke very briefly about what we thought the poll outcomes might be before we went to broadcast, and it's true, right? The extent of the reaction perspective really is pretty dramatic. I would have said reactive as well. One of the things that we spoke about as well is, you know, we've just heard Laura there speaking on, you know, on behalf of a tech company, really forward focused, and we'll hear from Janine as well on pharmaceuticals. Now these are really cutting edge forward organizations who I think kind of get it. And we spoke about the diversity of the types of organizations we have now. I'm working for a really big bank, more than 150 years old. And I would have said reactive, because almost all the diversity and inclusion initiatives and changes that we have seen in our organization are the result of employee resource groups. They're the result of employees getting together and sharing what is important about them and how they want their organization to adapt and accommodate them. And so it's really important to have ERGs because they are almost internal lobby groups. They're almost internal unions, so to speak. And so quite often large, complex multinational organizations are reactive. We see it not only in the way that they react to the feedback from employees requesting and asking for change, but they're also reactive in the way that we see them respond to things like the murder of George Floyd last year, a really crisp, clear example of how a really significant event can cause organizations to really wake up and take a jump forwards. But I'm going to also give them credit, because at the same time, whilst a lot of this is reactive and prompted either by internal or external stimuli, what I have found is leadership get it. They understand it, but more often or not, they need help in understanding what it is needs to change. And so ensuring, as Laura said, you've got that ability for colleagues at all levels to feed back up into leadership about what is important to them helps ensure that your organization will remain dynamic and change and adapt.
Yeah, it sounds like communication is very key, storytelling, and just keeping the dialogue open. So Janine, I'm going to turn the next question over to you with respect to what extent do you believe that organizations have really moved the needle with respect to DEIB?
Thanks, Betty.
And what are some practical, tactical recommendations that you might have to actually move the needle?
Yeah, I think that many organizations, as we're discussing, right, they are accelerating their awareness of the topics, and we rely on these ERGs as part of the structure to inform where the culture is going, who we are, who we want to be. When we think of 5 generations in the workforce, right, that wasn't the case before, and we're hitting a gap, right? We're going to hit a gap with the labor that is available and what that looks like. So if you just think of the natural progression of how that changes, that's really important to keep in mind, right? Because the things that we've encountered, they're changing, and the language we use changes, right, over time. So with that, the structures of ERGs as an example, that is a really key area where we're moving the needle, right? But it's just one of them. Other areas include mentoring. I launched a mentoring program this past year, and I'm really proud of the fact that over 40% of those individuals are active ERG members, right? In addition to employees, because what we've seen is that with mentoring is that if you're a person of color, underrepresented, or a woman, you are not naturally going to find yourself, right, surrounded by people who are mentoring and then even sponsoring you. So by creating structures like this, we're giving people greater access, right? And that's the key here. It's that if we can take things that do work, we know mentorship works, and really just increase the accessibility of something like that, that magic of mentoring, right? Me looking after Jack and saying, Jack, this is where you have to grow, and being really transparent and honest, right? In a way that I'm looking after you. That's not something that naturally occurs. When I think of myself and the roles that I've walked into or grown into, right? They're not things that I dreamed about 10 years because we didn't know they existed. So the world is changing, and by creating these structures of ERGs, right, informing the culture, mentoring, keeping us close to the talent, right, this is moving the needle. And it may not be in the numbers, right, all the time, but it's in the culture, the feel, the engagement. The other piece that I've seen is that, you know, when we talk about what gets measured gets done, you all have different scorecards that we work against internally and externally. But what I do like to see right now is that we have Bloomberg, for example, NASDAQ coming out, right, with their board diversity, right, what their requirements are. Bloomberg with their ESG scores. What we're seeing is that investors are really holding companies accountable on their scorecards. They're asking for that public disclosure, right? So that's something that all of us are talking about. And that may be a moment of we're being reactive, but it's also something we've been talking about for a while to try to figure this out. So there's different approaches. What we can measure will help us, but we're also doing things at the same time. So when I think of the multiple levers that we're all pulling and what works for our companies, that's where I think we need grace to really customize things, right? Because what works for my company may not be working for Jack, or there may be a different priority. So I think for any employee walking into an organization, it's not to say that they have to do the 10 things we talk about today. It's to ask them what they're doing and if that's authentic, and if their leaders really support that and believe in that, and ask for that activity, that traction, and what's holding them accountable. Because it is different for every company. In some cases, we are reactive because we have to be, and because it's new. So I think for all of that, we are moving the needle. It just looks different.
Thanks a lot, Janine. Yeah, measurability, accountability, really key. Before I turn it over to Jack, I actually was very curious about your mentoring program and how do you recruit your mentors? How are, you know, is it a mandatory program for certain people to be a part of it? Just kind of curious how that structure works.
So for the mentoring program, we asked people to opt in, and it was a great opportunity for people to opt in from a mentor perspective as well as a mentee, because we want people who are committed. And I have to say that I showed up at senior leader meetings and I said, this is what we're doing. And they all raised their hands. So I'm actually in a place where we have more mentors than we have mentees. So I'm encouraging people to opt in, where the levels of interest is so high, right? Something as simple as giving someone your time and working with them. And the structure within it is pretty open, but we tie it back to, right, the individual story, right? Who are you as an individual? What are you seeking? And where are you moving that forward? So I think with all of that's where I've been. I've run mentoring programs at other companies. And I think where you have it be a requirement, right? A moment where everybody has to do it. Having people opt in, it really gives an opportunity to take the people who really want to help, the people who are asking for help, they're in the mindset to grow, right? So when I think of, you know, we have a concept called fixed mindset, growth mindset. When you can put people in that stage and put them together, great things can happen and we can support them. So some of the structures I put in place is having office hours, right? Having that support, because it really, I think it depends on what people need and how we can customize around that. So really proud of where that is right now and where it's going.
Fantastic. So Jack, I know you have some perspectives on mentoring programs, but I'd also love to hear your overall thoughts in terms of to what extent do you believe organizations are really moving the needle, and also some specific practical, tactical recommendations to move the needle?
Yeah, so Janine, I mean, was really, really right in that what is the needle measuring, right? Look, are we going in the right direction when it comes to raising awareness around the importance of diversity and inclusion within the corporate space? Yes, right. We're having more and more conversations. Leaders are getting it more and more. On the whole, there are still many, many leaders that don't, but you know, they're becoming fewer and far between, and certainly are starting to stick out, which I think is a really, really good thing. Are we moving the needle on engagement and belonging? Yes, but still a huge way to go, and we've got to refine our approach, right? We're still very reactive, as we spoke in the last question. So when something hits the newspapers, quite often organizations will respond by hosting a panel session or perhaps updating a policy if they're doing well. But it is often, as I say, as a result of stimuli, and you know, that just needs to be more often. Are we moving the needle when it comes to representation? Very slowly. And I think that's the frustration that all of us who exist in the D&I world have, is that we are trying to implement a intergenerational representation change within our lifetimes. And it's certainly within our career lifetimes. And that can be really difficult. And it can often, for D&I practitioners, be quite a hard thing for us to come to terms with. What is the pace of change that we need in order to feel that the needle is moving at the right pace? We know that gender representation still is going to take hundreds of years to fix if we continue at this pace. We know that ethnicity representation, especially in leadership, is barely off the ground. So are we moving the needle enough there? No. And so it does take time for this advocacy, for this conversation, and for these interventions to make a difference, but we must maintain the pressure at all time, because until that change is happening at the pace we need it to benefit our children and our children's children's, then it's not fast enough. And then specific interventions, well, I think we have all heard at some point the senior leader come and say, I am really active around gender inclusion because, you know, my two daughters, I want them to live in a better world than I live. Especially men, senior leaders, they take inspiration and they have a perspective brought to them through their family status, because they're dealing with that very closely, and they're having conversations with their daughters about the issues that they face. Reverse mentoring over and over again seems to be one of the most impactful ways that we can help people in power understand the systemic biases and the obstacles that our minority groups face. And so Janine's reverse mentoring program there is absolutely a best-in-class approach, because it's being able to create these intergenerational, often, communication channels that help open the perspective of the people in power to those who need it.
Thank you so much, Jack. You know, going to what you said about the pace of change, it's interesting. About 3 years ago, my daughter, who is now 13, she'd asked, so she was 10 at the time, she said to me, Mommy, when I get older, can I take over your businesses? And you know, at that point, I naively said to her, well, Maria, by the time you reach that age, hopefully there will no longer be a need for what I do. But as we know, actually, it will be a very long time. And what we've seen, especially in the past year and a half or so, has definitely shown that. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about TAIQ. So TAIQ's core philosophy and belief is that culture is the sum of the individuals. And therefore, how we as individuals think, act, and interact with respect to inclusion ultimately influences how organizations look with respect to diversity and representation, how they act with respect to promoting diversity and inclusion, and how they feel in terms of the employee's sense of belonging and equity. So I'm curious, I'm going to turn it over to Laura. I'm curious in terms of, your reaction to that statement with respect to the importance of inclusive behaviors, how we think, act, and interact. And then also, what are your thoughts in terms of what exactly are inclusive behaviors? Because frankly, a lot of times people say, oh, I'm inclusive, but do they really know what that means? So I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Betty. So inclusive for me really means you're listening to ideas and gaining different perspectives from all employees and team members. So it's not about just listening, but also incorporating those thoughts from different backgrounds, from different experiences. I am a big fan of Gallup Strength Finder assessment. I've used it the last 15 years across 3 different organizations. And it really helps you identify the strengths of the people that you're working with. In driving inclusion, it helps employees to be understood and valued for their unique qualities. So employees who feel they belong share more opinions and share more ideas. Therefore, they're more engaged. The team motto and philosophy that I learned from 2 inspiring leaders and mentors, and I'm going to give them a shout out, Eric Wansong and Scott Betos. I've incorporated that into my leadership across 3 different companies as well. And it's all around together we win. And this is not just an inspiring quote. It's really a way of living, of thriving. And it really means succeeding together and recognizing each other's great work, regardless of their background, regardless of the culture, regardless of their stories. So it means that every day, we really deliver that excellence, to our customers as one team, but we win as a team and we learn as a team. So gaining everybody's perspective and not just listening to those perspectives, Betty, but really actioning on those. That's what it means to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Actually, you had mentioned that you'd done an assessment. You've also done the TAIQ assessment, the TAIQ behavioral assessment. And yes. I'm curious what you learned about yourself and also what your experience was with the assessment itself.
Yeah, I think my main takeaways from the TAIQ, behavioral assessment was really around continuing listening, open interaction, daily mindfulness, and reinforcement to drive that positive intelligence. So, I talk a lot about listening and being open when interacting, but it's that self-awareness and it's that continued self-awareness of having that level of interaction. So for me, those were really the key takeaways. As I did the assessment, we always can learn from doing some self-assessments and self-awareness, and there's areas that I need to continually work on as well.
Great. So Jack, I'm going to turn it over to you. Would love to hear your thoughts regarding what does it really mean to be inclusive? And I understand you also took the TAIQ behavioral assessment, and I'd love to hear what you learned about yourself and maybe some thoughts that came to mind as you were taking the assessment.
Yeah, I mean, so as Laura mentioned, any opportunity to go use a tool that helps you reflect on your own approaches and perspectives is a really valuable thing. And certainly that's what I got from completing that assessment. It was challenging you. It was really asking you to think about your behaviors and the way that you operate in the workplace and indeed outside the workplace. So it was definitely a valuable thing to go through and to figure out and to challenge yourself and think, am I actually assessing myself truthfully? Am I assessing myself realistically? And am I being generous enough to my team's assessment? Because of course you actually get to assess not only yourself, but also your team, right? Which can be quite a fun little element there. So it was definitely a really, really good and useful prompt for people to consider. And I think, one of the biggest issues that we do face, and we touched on this just now, is that inclusive leaders, you can have some inclusive leaders who say, yes, I'm very inclusive, but actually are still, completely unaware of the biases, don't fully understand the full spectrum of inclusiveness either. And there are leaders who really get it, who really try hard and are really changing the way that they operate in order to really bring in more perspectives into their decision making. For the leaders who get it on the surface, right, going through this TAIQ assessment is going to be quite a challenge for them because it is a long period of self-reflection, and you can say, oh yes, I'm very da 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 da. But in reality, if you're then going to get feedback from your team that actually that's not the case, it's going to be a moment of realization for you. So I think there's definite value there for people to do it. The second, Betty, sorry, what was the second part?
Well, I guess it's really, well, actually you primarily addressed, and also like, was there anything in particular that you realized about yourself? From the assessment?
I mean, I'm always well aware that I love, I get really excited about D&I, and I'm always trying to consciously ensure that I'm letting other people ensure that they're having their perspective added as well. And I think that something I always need to do is pause and actually seek out perspectives from those who haven't spoken.
Excellent, excellent. And for participants, just so you know, we will be sharing a link to this free TAIQ behavioral assessment for each of you to take. It's accessible on our website, taiqworld.com. And you take it for 15, 20 minutes, and within seconds of completing, you will get your personalized heat map as well as report with recommendations. And so assessing is definitely important in terms of assessing behavior, but we have to take it a step further, because once you assess and you realize, oh, you have areas to work on, it's really about how do you affect those behavioral changes. And a lot of that is about embedding those behaviors in the day-to-day so that it is habit forming. And quite frankly, that's one of the reasons why TAIQ is so focused on reinforcement learning. But I'm just really curious and to hear Laura, Janine, your perspectives, because a lot of times organizations, they embark on unconscious bias training, which oftentimes can be one-off. And I'm just curious in terms of your experience as participants, and also Janine as a DEI practitioner, in terms of the impact of such unconscious bias training. So maybe Laura, I'll start with you, or Janine, up to you.
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, while I believe it is essential that companies do more than one-off training days, you have to start somewhere. So I think it's important to recognize a company's first step as well as their ongoing commitment. I do believe that unconscious bias training is extremely valuable. It really opened my eyes to my own biases. I took my first one when I was at VMware, and I took another one when I was at Equinix. And, it just, again, it's that awareness, right? And so being able to really drive that level and awareness across not just yourself, but your team members as well. And, at Cologix, we're making sustainable change as its strategic priority for the company. When it becomes part of that business strategy, you have that foundation to continually work on the cultural DNA. So key point is you have to start somewhere, and that's a great start.
Janine?
Yeah, so just listening and reflecting and taking in the question, there's a lot of research out there that I've been looking at that it's going to take 2 generations to solve for unconscious bias. So if we can all just start with, we're all biased, the degree of that bias depends on your upbringing and the experiences that you have. Implicit bias we can solve for in 20 years. That's where we are able to disrupt ourselves, right, and really eliminate a preference for fill in the blank of someone over another based on their background. Right. So when we talk about unconscious bias, it's evolving, but it's also really, we're on a mountain, right? So we have to chip away at it a little bit at a time. And I think of this as every time you attend a session on a topic such as this, you always take away something new. You uncover a different bias that you had. So keeping it centered to increase our awareness and our fluency of other cultures is paramount. So we could say that the one-off is, a piece of the big puzzle, and is it really impactful? I would say it's foundational and really setting the stage for each individual to grow from that moment, right? So it's not to say that adding more of unconscious bias training is going to solve for it. It's just that we have to keep it present in the conversation and use this as a tool. There's so much that goes into all of these factors of how we fill in the blank on everyone walking in the room, that the fear of flight, right? This this moment that we have, this innate need to fill in the blank on everyone, it's really just natural. So when we sit here and we take away the stigma and the negativity around it and say, we have it, what are we doing to disrupt it? What are we doing to expand our experiences? This is where some of these assessments can come in handy. So we also use assessments, and I use one that rates you, and you self-rate, and then it rates you. And with that becomes an opportunity to action plan against that difference. And the TAIQ also increases that awareness. So, all of these tools offer that moment of clarity on where is it do I have to journey as an individual? And then what is my responsibility to my team, my employees, people around me in my circle to disrupt the bias that they maybe have or displaying that's impacting someone, be it on a hiring decision, why you promote them, or why you put them into a volunteer role, because it's not just a company problem, right? We see this in public service and in the teachers that we have, as well as our personal, right, interaction. So the one-off moment of unconscious bias training is that we know it isn't enough. It's just a tool that we lean on to keep the conversation going, and that each of them are different. Each of them offers something different, and based on how that impacts people, we need to keep really, for lack of a better word, diversifying that training as best as we can.
Yeah, I wanted to echo what you were saying, in terms of unconscious bias. We all have our biases. DI professionals, we have our biases too. It's not like we're immune. Everyone has biases because, biases are the results of our access, exposure, upbringing, and education, right? So let's take some of the things that you said one step further. I'd really love to hear, perhaps we'll start off with Jack. Then, so how do we then really create sustainable change in DEIB? What can we do to really embed and go beyond that unconscious bias training?
Right, yeah. I mean, unconscious bias is core to what we do. The whole practice around diversity and inclusion exists to counteract the bias that exists within our societies, within our systems, and within ourselves, right? And so unconscious bias learning should not be positioned as a fix for individuals, but it should be positioned as an explanation of the importance of diversity and inclusion practicing, right? Because we know that society operates like this, and all the interventions that we aim to implement is that weight to make it level. And that is why diversity and inclusion exists as a practice. And so we know that unconscious bias exists. We know that bias exists within our systems. And so it's giving people that awareness of the importance and their role to play in counteracting the identified biases that we know about, such as recruitment bias, promotional bias, and indeed the way that we design our products and services. There's bias in everything that we do, because sometimes we're not thinking about certain customer groups. And so making sure that we have that diversity of thought and perspective woven throughout the organization is the reason for diversity and inclusion, which is the ultimate result in ensuring that we create products and services that are suitable for a broad spectrum customer base. And that is where the profitability of diversity and inclusion comes from. So it's a multitude of interventions. You've got interventions all within the HR world, you've got interventions in the operations world. Everybody within the organization has a role to play, and everybody has specific interventions that are going to be appropriate to counteract the bias that they have control over. And so that's where I think that this all comes to head.
Thank you. So I wanted to share some research that I've come across that in order to really affect lasting behavioral change, 20% of it comes from insight. So for example, workshops, unconscious bias training, but actually 80% of lasting change comes from mental muscle. So really that habit formation and so forth. And so that's one of the primary reasons why, while TAIQ provides workshops, we really focus on that daily reinforcement learning to really truly embed inclusive behaviors into the day-to-day cultural DNA. And so I was just curious, actually, any of the panelists can answer this question in terms of, what have you seen really work in terms of embedding inclusive behavior into the day-to-day?
Yeah, Betty, I'll just jump in that we know it takes 7 times to do something to form a habit, right? So if we take that moment and we take all these tried and true methodologies with diet, for example, right? We know that we have to get it to a place where it's comfortable to build it in throughout the day. So I think when we had the moment of George Floyd, right, a lot of companies went to, how do we just have an open table discussion because we don't have a solution. So if I think of the platform of the courageous conversation, right, but also the tools of mental health and well-being, it's how are you feeling, right, versus how are you doing. We're not asking the project status, we're asking how you're truly feeling at your core. And when we embed these basic daily tips of how do we look after someone for their emotional well-being, suddenly all the work and all that innovation, like we're unlocking that. So for my part, I'll say that anywhere we can build a daily habit for a weekly habit of checking in, that's not necessarily a meeting, because we've also seen that meeting fatigue, but that it's a natural piece of just getting to know someone. Because when we can get to the deeper differences of one another, and we have leaders putting that at the front of how they get to know their team, that's where we see lasting change, because that knowledge builds of that individual, where it's not just that I know, right, you're from a different country, you speak a different language, but it's also, what is it that is blocking you personally, professionally, that I can help with? And suddenly our ability to navigate those cultural differences go up. So I think anywhere where we can build those daily habits and routines that support diversity, I think that's where we can win.
Just to build on Janine's point there, it is about that weaving through diversity and inclusion approach into the operations, into the way that we operate, and the touch points that we all have in the workplace. So, come annual review time, managers need to be prompted about biases that are often present in the review process and given guidance and tools to counteract that bias. In the recruitment process, our recruiters need to be aware of the common biases available, and as they use their tools and their systems and their software, there should be checks and prompts built into that as it is operated to counteract the biases that we all really know now. Awareness of systemic bias in operations is a really starting to become a very well understood process now. And so, to Janine's point, it is not big focus days or events and big bang things. It's small drip, regular interventions that ensure inclusive behavior is consistently applied.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, Betty, I mean, the only thing I would add would be really to spend time getting to truly know yourself, as well as other people who look at the world differently than you. I talked about unconscious bias. One of my pivotal learnings was around that and how it impacts my decision-making, my actions, and really it's for all of us. So, I agree with you. Everyone has biases, and we see what we think. It's important to know yourself, but also how you frame your thoughts and actions and working with others.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to launch a poll. Actually, hold on. I've already. Why is it not letting me launch this second poll?
Because something has to go wrong in each of these.
Okay, got it. Okay, here we go. To what extent do you believe your organization is embedding inclusive behavior into cultural DNA? Would love to hear. And just while we're waiting for the results, I have to say that I'm really proud of what TAIQ has been doing in terms of embedding, inclusion into cultural DNA using daily drip. And we've actually seen really measurable and perceivable impact where teams are actually, as a result of going through the program, they are scoring their teams as being more inclusive after going through the program. And Janine, what you were saying, it's true, it takes time. And what we've seen actually is that habit formation takes on average about 60 to 66 days, but it could really range from, I believe it was 12 days to 252 days, somewhere in that range, but the sweet spot is around 60 to 66 days. And so that's why our programs are really focused on that kind of sweet spot. But let's share the results of this poll. To what extent do you believe your organization is embedding inclusive behavior into cultural DNA?
That is a nice
6%,
bell
not
curve.
at all. Yep, a little, 29%, a little, somewhat, 37%, very much, 29, extremely, 6%. Okay, well, why don't we actually, I know that some questions have been asked, and so let's open up to Q&A. Marlon, take it away.
Hi, Betty. We have a number of questions here, so I'm going to start up with the first one. The first one is, do you think survey results are biased by the self-selected webinar attendees? We're not a representative sample, are we?
Yeah, and I think this is where all of us rely on benchmarks from external, right? Knowing that sometimes we might have, for lack of a better word, the choir coming to the table, right? But I think starting with the choir is indicative of where we should go next, right? And if we feel this way, that there's probably glaring discrepancies elsewhere. So I know for myself, I'll rely on external benchmark data in addition to my internal data. And just having received my annual survey results, that's how I would look to make sure that we're not biased.
Marlon, next question.
Sure. Many believe a future work world will be much more virtual. Thus, differences in race, culture, gender, or other characteristics become less obvious and or irrelevant. In this scenario, where face-to-face interactions are unnecessary, how will diversity be defined?
I mean, I saw this question, and it is, you know, my perspective is it is way too early to even know. It is changing so much, and actually new diversity traits are emerging as a result of this, the mobile and the non-mobile, right? And so those who can get into the office maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and those who can't, there is a equalization in some respects, but there's also a widening gap in other respects. And we've got to, as D&I practitioners, not only be focused on the D&I strands that we're familiar with, gender, disability, ethnicity, so on and so forth, but always be consciously aware of the evolving landscape of diversity. And I think that this is something that still we need to be, well, we are keeping an eye on, and it's not something I think that the industry, so to speak, or the practitioner base has fully been able to define just yet.
Well, I can just speak for example, throughout this pandemic, obviously, we've got a virtual workforce, and we have a group of employees that's part of the culture, what they call it, the culture club, and it's really been all around employee engagement and getting to know the employees, across our global platform. And I think that level of employee engagement is going to be important for us as we continue to have this hybrid workforce. And so I would say continued focus on that employee engagement and instilling it into the core strategy and operations, as part of our daily culture.
There's another component here I want to mention is that we've seen stats go up that people of color feel more comfort working from home because they feel there's less opportunities for microaggressions, right, or racist comments or things that make them feel uncomfortable. So I think it goes back to the basics of neutral, equal access. So if we have people coming in, it's important we encourage people to come into the equal access in person or virtually to make sure that the side conversations, right, the golf course conversations aren't eliminating people. So we have to make sure that representation and opportunity is still there. But I think there's something too with the piece of the comfort and that engagement of people feeling that it reduces their emotional trauma when it comes to these pieces of race, right, and discrimination. So just something to also consider when we look at this.
Most corporations have adapted, at least in a visual way, to include diversity and inclusion in their operations. Even with the Bloomberg approach, the use of diversity as a tool to ultimately add to the bottom line. Hiring women, hiring from minority groups who largely have the same mindset as we've seen leads to some internal change. but has had marginal impact on the greater society. Isn't this evidenced by the divisions plaguing our world and the fragility of our global democracy?
No, I think with this one, there's accuracy to this comment, but I think this is where company commitment is right, where we know that we're only going to be able to influence so much internally because that's what we can control. So if I could just kind of fall to the pillars that I look at, and one of those pillars is marketplace, the products. How do they serve the communities that we're in, as well as community, right? How can we volunteer and support in a sustainable way so that we can really encourage the community to thrive, right? Where it needs it, where there's greater access and needs. So when I think of this, it's not just the representation part is very, very important in how we foster that talent, but there's other pieces to this where it's a piece that we have to give back that companies have a responsibility for. And I see companies step up, but this also goes to the individual's responsibility to influence the community. So when we see these divides, we have to realize that companies, they have ability to change, but they can't fix all of this. So when I think of public service and going back to the educational, these are institutions that we need to hold them accountable as well as individuals.
The last question, and the other questions that we've received, Betty, I guess what we can do is share these other questions that we don't raise here with the panel, and if they can give us their reaction to them, we can consolidate them and probably post them in our blog.
Okay,
that
sounds
works.
good.
Okay, this is the last question. In the past, companies and organizations have generally been top heavy. They tended to pass directives, guidance, and instructions to their employees. Lately, it appears that there has been a tremendous upswirl from the bottom to the top. For instance, during the pandemic, many people quit their jobs and appear to have been more aggressive in dictating terms of their employment. In addition, more people in the bottom ranks of companies and organizations have also been more willing to speak out against the upper ranks of companies and organizations. How does this change the dynamics for companies and organizations in terms of reactivity and proactivity?
I think it's a great one, and I think it's definitely a lot of truth in that. The power of the individual against the organization is stronger than ever before, and that is in part to the focus of listening to the employee that has occurred, in addition to the labor market situation that we find ourselves in. How does this change the dynamic for companies and organizations in terms of reactivity and proactivity? I mean, personally, I think it's still going to be reactive, but I think it's going to be reactive at a much quicker pace.
Thank you. I'm turning it over to you, Betty.
Okay, great. Well, we're actually at time, but I just wanted to turn it over to Laura, Janine, and Jack for any parting thoughts, just based on what you heard today. Anything you feel you really want to express before we conclude.
Well, first of all, Betty, thank you for having us. Really, we're all very passionate about this topic, so giving us the opportunity to kind of share our stories, really appreciate it. I think for me, it's all around visible commitment, holding ourselves and others accountable and being authentic and vulnerable throughout this journey. It's continuous engagement on this topic to drive throughout organization, and it's part of the journey. And so, thank you for having us on, and I will turn it over to Jack.
Thanks, Laura. And again, to everybody, not only, who you can see on the screen now, but who has joined in, thanks for joining the conversation. Like, this is how we get better, is by sharing our experiences and realizing that there are many people who are committed to it. I think what we've really learned today is that actually the power of change lies within the individual getting together collectively, either through an employee resource group or through making your voice heard, or ultimately walking with your feet at the end of the day, if that is the case. And, the market is certainly in your favor there. So take strength in that and realize that as an individual, you do have a power to influence the change of culture within your organization.
Great. And I'll just close out with, right, I think Laura, Jack, and I, and Betty, we are all just so eager and passionate to do the most that we can in this space, right? But we also need to pause and actively listen, and we seek opportunities to do so. So the only way we can get better is if all of you and our employees and our leaders also hold us accountable. And that's a two-way street, right? Because we have to keep the conversation going, because, going back to the stats I mentioned earlier, it's going to be a really long journey. It's 2gen, right, for that unconscious bias. And while we can say that, it should be something we can solve for sooner, to Betty's point, we have to realize that it's going to take time, and we have to keep honing this muscle together. So we can only do so by continuing to hold each other accountable. So thank you all for your commitment to being with us today. And thank you, Betty, for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So yes, I want to thank Laura, Jack, Janine for being our panelists today and for providing such valuable insights into how we can move the needle in 2022 and beyond. I hope you all have enjoyed and benefited from this discussion as much as I have. Please do stay tuned. This is just the first of a series of events that we'll be holding. The next one will be in February, where we will have be joined by other great thought leaders as well. Please do take your TAIQ behavioral assessments free. A link has been shared online, and then we'll also be reaching out with a recording of this video and also the link to the behavioral assessment after this call. But actually, Marlon and Emma, can you just share screen in terms of how everyone can stay in touch with TAIQ? Please do reach out to us.
Oh, we got a flash of Marlon
you got a flash of Marlon then. If you could share the screen, that would be great. And if not, we will share our contact information soon. So enjoy the holidays. Thank you so much to everyone.